All right. So this is the first stream of Bubooverse. And in this stream, we're going to look at biological robots. I'm drinking some pu'er tea here to stay nice and caffeinated. I have a little setup here. I have my keyboard and I have a Intuos Pro Bluetooth tablet. I use this tablet to be able to highlight stuff, which apparently isn't working here. I don't know why. Let me try resetting the tablet here. Let me try refreshing this page. I think this, yeah. This keyboard got disconnected, guys. Let's reconnect it. Okay. That's working, and these are working. Okay. Let's go ahead and delete these. All right, so this software that I'm using here is called Paperpile. It's a kind of like a Mendeley. Just costs $5 a month, not super expensive. I would heavily recommend it if you read papers. Let's try to adjust this, center this stuff on the screen. Okay, so we're going to be looking at biological robots. This is a paper out of Michael Levin's group at Tufts University in Massachusetts. So also some affiliations with Harvard, also a Boston school. So this is an interesting paper because it introduces kind of what I think is going to be a huge trend in the future, which is the kind of robotics moving away from just metal and plastic and starting to look at using cells as kind of the basic building blocks of robotics, and maybe how that can make things that are much more complicated and much more interesting. So here in the abstract, right, lots of wording around kind of the limitations. I think really the key, this is almost a diss paper on the way that robots are done nowadays. Essential to refine frameworks. Yeah. Consilience, relationship between form. We hope these new fields. And we actually have Boo here saying hi to the microphone. Boo, you want to say hi? She's smelling the microphone. Maybe we can get her to play with the tablet. All right. So again, I think the key introduction here is this joining of two different disciplines, biology and robotics, which have kind of always been mostly separate, but are not super separate because there is a bunch of stuff in biological robots, but it's always kind of been super toy stuff. And not that this stuff isn't super toy, this stuff is also super toy, but we'll see. here. I think this is kind of some of the questions that they're really trying to ask here. What is a robot? Is it a machine, an organoid, an organism? Right? That's a very kind of solid point there of, if you made a robot entirely out of cells, would you consider that a robot? Would that still be a machine, right? Or did you create a new organism? I think a lot of biology people would say that you've just created a new organoid or a new organism, right? Like these tiny little brains or tiny little hearts that people have made before. But calling it a machine feels weird. But at the end of the day, right, that is kind of what you've done. You've assembled a bunch of components into one entity or one agent that undergoes a bunch of sense, planning, and acting loops, even if you don't actually directly control those, because those are controlled by the cells themselves. Okay, so now we start going into what this what they will eventually kind of call xenobots in this paper, which is, right, self-motile biological robots. Oh shit, still getting the hang of this, guys. Oh good lord. All right, screw it, we're highlighting all of this. Self-motile biological robots. I think we're gonna get rid of we're just gonna do this, yeah. Gender to broad support, okay. System is not a robot nor engineered. It's what biologists traditionally define as an animal cap. So why don't we go ahead and look at what that actually means. Animal cap biology. All right. So animal cap is the area around the animal pole of the blastula. So blastula is one of the very first stages of embryonic development. I don't think it's specific to mammals. I think it's a bunch of different animals have it. And then the animal cap is kind of this top part here, right? This top part of the blastula. Okay, so then the mesoderm is kind of this middle part, and then the endoderm is, it seems like, the main meat of it. I think if we go to images, maybe we can get actual pictures here. Animal cap dissections. All right, so embryonic development of the organism, procedure eggs, blastular. Okay, this is interesting. So people are already injecting RNA and growth factors to induce specific development within the tissue. My initial experience with animal cap dissections has reinforced the notion that cells are already aligned on a certain path of development even before gastrulation. So this is another kind of interesting part of Levin's work, and if you haven't listened to the podcast he does with Lex Friedman, for example, I would heavily recommend that. He talks about how a lot of development in these early stages where you have these animal caps and blastulas and stuff like that is actually controlled through electrical fields, right? These cells create slight electrical fields, and then those electrical fields kind of design the cell. Take another sip of that coffee. Or that tea, my bad. Okay, so back to where we were. So the animal cap, they describe it here as a region of developing frog embryo. So we're going to learn later that part of the name xenobot is not just the fact that or xenobot, it's a specific frog. There's like a frog that has the name Xeno in its scientific name. So the fact that they use a bunch of frog tissue makes more sense for the name Xeno. Okay, so initially they made biohybrid robots which use a combination of synthetic scaffold and cardiac muscle-based actuation. So synthetic scaffold basically means, right, synthetic scaffold. Synthetic scaffolds for muscular skeletal tissue engineering. Let's go images. I feel like images is always cooler. So yeah, so synthetic vessel, synthetic valve. So synthetic scaffolds, right? Natural synthetic scaffold are basically, I think it almost looks like a cotton ball or some kind of material that is porous in nature, and then you kind of soak it in cells, or it allows for the cells to kind of attach to it and then form the structure. So it's a way to create the kind of shape that you want the cells to populate, and then the cells will kind of stick to it and then differentiate. And I think I know they use this for all kinds of things like tendons, and I know they use it for bones. I've seen when people maybe have like a hole in their skull or something, they'll put a little bone scaffold there, and then they'll put the bone cells on it, and then it'll turn to bone. Again, guys, I'm not a biologist, so I may be making some of this stuff up. So take it with a grain of salt. All right. So that's kind of where they started, I think, a bunch of the initial research of this group. So now they've kind of gone beyond that, right? And using these same artists, okay, yeah, so they replaced the synthetic scaffolds with living materials, right? So no longer are they creating the shape that they want using a synthetic scaffold and just merely kind of putting the real living cells on top of it. They are replacing all of it. So the entire xenobot is made with living materials. Okay. Cilia-based actuation, blah, blah, blah. Spherical. Ooh. Live tissues, author's view. Okay. Okay, so here we have a bunch of pictures of these little xenobots that they've created. So there's kind of two ways to actuation can be achieved through modal cilia, contractile muscle tissue, or a combination of the two. So cilia are basically these little hairs. So it's these little specialized cells that kind of grow in these little hairs, and inside a liquid medium, all kinds of different small single-celled organisms can kind of move around. So if we actually look at videos, I don't know if it's worth going on YouTube, but basically these little cells can kind of push the cell through the liquid medium. So here we have some non-shaped. So I don't think this is just a sphere. I think the sphere is kind of what the default shape is when you kind of create it in a vacuum and you don't put a scaffold. And all along the outside of all of these here, you have little cilia, right? And those cilia push this little shape around. The other type of actuation that they can do here is muscle actuation. So here you can actually see it's shaped like a little horseshoe almost. And I'm assuming that kind of within these, there's specific layouts of muscle cells that basically when they twitch or contract, it'll kind of shoot this little robot forward. And then it actually sounds like they've created combinations of muscle and cilia. So actuation that has both of those. And it'd be interesting to see whether one of them atrophies or whether they can actually coordinate, right? Predictable. Future goal. Yeah, a lot of this. So I think here, for example, there's been dispute when using the term robot to describe our designs. I think maybe one of my biggest negatives to this paper is that they focus a lot on kind of the perception of this work in the scientific community. There's a lot of they don't like our terminology, and people don't think this is the correct way to do it. And I don't know, honestly, I think that why care about the haters? Just ignore them and decide to do your own thing. And as long as your research is interesting and reproducible, then you're good to go, right? Don't worry about people being dogmatic about terminology and worrying about citation and kind of all the negatives that come with the reality of kind of the bureaucracy that is the scientific community. They mention a couple other previous works on this. Again, these seem to be the same combination from before, so some kind of synthetic soft scaffold and muscle tissue, right? So the combination of using a synthetic scaffold to define the structure of the cells and then just kind of like bathing it with cells of that type. But kind of all the hard work of creating the form is falling on the human designing the synthetic scaffold. And I think a big differentiator between those kinds of works and the kind of work that Levin's group is doing here is entirely making the robot out of biological tissue. Open loop control systems, right? So I think this is important here. These are not closed loop yet, right? In the classic sense, plan, act loop, right? Let's go ahead, let's try drawing. Underline, highlight. Can I draw on this? Pencil. So let's go ahead. So we have, let's try to do sense. Oh. Goes into, I have to click this every time. Wow, that is terrible. Paper pile, step up your shit. Sense, plan. Oh, let's delete it. We're going to get better at streaming, so don't worry if this is unbearable right now. Also, heavily recommend watching on more than 1.0 speed. You should be watching this at 1.5 speed. So sense, plan, act. That is not quite an A, but what does it mean by open loop? So open loop means that this is not a closed loop, right? The planning does not, this arrow doesn't exist, basically, is the problem. Is that the planning and the acting are separate from the sensing. In fact, this arrow probably doesn't even exist either. You have no control as the human over what these cells do. These cells are each individually In fact, maybe the better way to describe this is that there's no planning. It's just sensing and acting, right? Which is kind of poses a more interesting question about biological systems of like, is there an actual planning loop at all, right? When you have a little cell with some cilia, oh wow, that looks terrible. When you have a little cell with some cilia and it's flying around in its little liquid medium, is it actually doing any planning, or are each of those individual little cells receiving some kind of sensory signal and then just immediately acting, right? Like, is there some kind of centralized planning going on, or is it all kind of edge compute, to overload that terminology? Okay, let's go back. Right, more stuff about science communication, sensationalism, kind of generic comments about peer review and kind of negativity around the scientific community. I don't know, that kind of stuff is boring, honestly. All right, here we go. So I think there's the different authors of this paper, each of them wrote a slightly different section, and you can tell because the kind of writing style is a little bit different for these. Okay, transforming. So they kind of talk about how in a lot of kind of early mythologies in other human cultures, you kind of have this concept of robots that are made out of something like mud, like a golem, or ivory for a Galatea, right? Creating a self-powered, self-driving, self-repairing, and self-replicating. I think that last part is actually the coolest, right? Self-driving, self-replicating Xenobot. Self-replicating is pretty crazy. The fact that somehow these Xenobots can produce more of themselves, right? At what point do living tissues become a robot? I think that's the kind of interesting question. Can we move sense? Parts of animals are not robots. Yeah, this is what I was referring to earlier, is that the frog that they use has Xenopus in its Latin name, so Xenobot can literally be referring to a robot made out of Xenopus cells, right? And they're using computer simulations to design these shapes, I think. Right, you could say that perhaps this little horseshoe shape that we see here is the result of a computer simulation, right? Where they said they kind of put a bunch of shapes into a computer, and it turns out that this shape is the one that allows you to propagate yourself through a liquid medium. So not super complicated stuff, but it is interesting, right? Where you start to use computers to design the robots for you. And in a way, you can think of that as the next step, right? Where you use synthetic scaffolds to basically force the cell to take a shape. And now you're using computers to design the shape that you then put the cells in. So isn't that kind of, you're using your human knowledge and human intuition about the best shape as a way to design the robot made of cells. And maybe the next step that we need to get to is get to a point where the cells themselves are defining the shape, the final shape of the robot, and there's no scaffold, and there's also no top-down design based on a computer simulation. So let's see. If removed from early frog embryos, a small piece of ectoderm called the animal cap will mature into form a ball of skin covered in cilia, which can propel the ball forward in water. So this is actually something crazy I didn't know. So tadpoles don't just glide, don't just move around with their little tail. They also have cilia all over them, which is kind of crazy to think about. I thought that cilia was more of a single-celled organism thing, but it's actually used in larger creatures, right? Like a tadpole is something you could see with your eyes. It's something you could hold in your hand, and it's somehow being propelled and glided through the water with cilia. Yeah, so they say these xenobots are autonomous, as in they move around, right? They're adaptive. They can repair their structure. Again, I think both autonomous and adaptive, like the definition is broad enough that you can kind of fudge it. And then intelligent is what they're asking here. And they kind of make some arguments here that the xenobots appear to behave perceptively. They suddenly decide to turn around, or they become interested in an object and examine it repeatedly. I think this goes back to what we were talking about with the sense, plan, and act. Like, what does it mean for a xenobot to decide to turn around? Like, how is there... do all the cells somehow come to a consensus, or is there one cell that, because of a certain chemical signal or a certain kind of electrical gradient, decides to start, or one cell changes the way that it's acting, and then all the nearby cells change the way that they're acting, and then the whole robot changes the way that they're acting, right? And this almost starts to get to the work of kind of swarm robotics, right? Oh, I just spilled my coffee. Let me clean that. It's also not coffee, it's puer tea. I'm just all over, dude. This is a sloppy first stream. I'll be back. Okay. So there's a lot of groups that do research on this. I know there's groups at MIT. Here's some little robots. This is University of Stuttgart. They're all moving around kind of in tandem. And one of the things they play around with here is kind of how do you control these systems? And is there like one centralized controller that controls all the robots, and then they all do what the centralized controller tells them to do? Or do each of the robots kind of have their own little control loop, and part of that little control loop is kind of sensing what the other parts of the swarm around them are doing, and then change what they're doing in response. So maybe some simple rules for what swarm can do is they can exhibit separation behavior, where when two elements of the swarm are too close together, they can kind of separate a little bit. Alignment, So if one element of the swarm starts turning, the one next to it starts turning too. And maybe there's some kind of similar effect happening here within these xenobots, although some of these behaviors, such as being interested in an object and examining it, that starts to suggest that maybe there is some kind of centralized planning, or maybe some kind of communication between the different cells within the xenobot. Okay. So we keep going in this paper. And again, they talk about kind of the name. They talk about this difficulty, and Levin talks about this in his interview with Lex Friedman, how actually the reason they do this with frog eggs is that frog cells can survive in fresh water without food, and then also moving around in a liquid medium is significantly easier. Mammal robots, much harder to do, right? Because you have to have some way to have the water within you, and it's a lot harder to move in a kind of dry environment, right? The wet lab kind of allows you to be much more sloppy than the kind of dry lab. But kind of the super cool, maybe conspiracy type thing to think about here is, what if the Greys aliens? So one interesting thought that I had while reading this paper is, what if the gray aliens that people describe seeing are the equivalent, or kind of where this all ends up, right? This whole field of designing biological robots and creating synthetic agents that are entirely made up of biological components, but they're kind of designed. What if that's what these little aliens are? What if that's not the actual alien, right? That the actual alien race that is intelligent doesn't look like this at all, but this is basically, they create these kind of drones, these worker drones, but rather than looking like this, right, like the Optimus robot, where they're entirely made out of metal and plastic and silicon, what if they're entirely made out of biological materials? They're grown. Something really cool that I thought about there. Again, I don't actually know. That's all conjecture, so don't paint me as an alien believer. Okay. So chimeras, blah, 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 to make the design solution pace. Okay, so, right, they kind of bring back this idea of using computational tools. So here they have different designs of robots. You can see that the way that they're using machine learning methods is they're basically maybe initializing a square volume of space that's voxelized into like a 10 by 10 grid, 10 by 10 by 10. And then the optimization algorithm can basically either choose to have these red muscle cells, or these kind of light blue, probably non-muscle cells. And you can see that the optimization algorithm comes up with these different ways of kind of putting all these cells, the muscle cells and the non-muscle cells, together in such a way that you can locomote. And if we actually look at the earlier picture in this paper, I think these here, right, you see this kind of little circle with two almost little legs, or this one here where you have, it looks like a square and then it has four little legs. Those are basically what we're seeing here. So I think that's some of the designs that they right? This one here with the 4 little legs, this one, and maybe this one. This is where they're getting these designs. And then here on the right side of this figure, we have the Xenobots designed for kinematic self-replication. So little Xenobots that can split and then create new versions of themselves. So these are, you see that a lot of them have kind of a symmetry component to them, right? Where you can kind of cut them down this middle part, or maybe they're designed to even break in this middle part, and then that will produce 2 kind of equal halves that can then go ahead and become 2 separate Xenobots. Okay. Exploring this space virtually allows us to filter out billions of bad designs. So maybe this is proof of simulation theory. That's what we are. We're a bunch of humans living in a simulation being created by a higher dimensional intelligent civilization that wants to learn how to design optimally for the number of space and time dimensions that we have. Yeah, they kind of give you the generic nonsense about computation being bad for the environment. I think this is way overblown. The majority of the time we spend so much energy in computation as a civilization to give people the optimal ads that using computation to advance biology is not even close to how bad that is. But, you know, they still feel like they need to say it. Okay, so here we have a new section written by another one of the authors. I think this is Bongard. Is that actually the name of one of the authors here? Blackiston Bongard. Yeah, so this guy. All right. So Kriegman kind of had a very interesting thing there, talking about design and where this all goes. Bongard starts to talk about here dichotomous thinking, making sense of nature and channeling what we know into embodied machines or disembodied, requires us to impose distinctions on natural phenomena. Yeah, so I think part of what is going on here is, right, humans kind of use language to think, and language has specific rules about kind of nouns and verbs, and nouns being separate from each other, and adjectives being something you can use to describe nouns, and this kind of way of categorizing the world and splitting it up into different nouns, different verbs, and having these clear separations. That's a human construct. That's not an actual reality or an actual truth about this reality. And then maybe by doing this, we're missing out on some of the truths about nature. So for example, right, how we separate things into genes, environment, phenotype, right? We spend a lot of time talking about gene manipulation, and more we realize that the genes are just a tiny part of this whole kind of emergent reality that has, it's not just the genes, it's the interplay of the genes and the epigenetics with the environment and the phenotype. Like there's all these things coming together to create the intelligence of humans, or even something like a xenobot, and that we can't just reduce it to the genes and looking at the genes. Brings up Cartesian dualism here. Deep cut. Yeah, there is no clear tape and machine in our self-replicating xenobot. So this again is with the theme that we were talking about earlier about, is there a centralized planner? And does that notion of having a centralized planner is that just wrong to begin with, right? Is that just this idea that dates all the way back to Turing, where you're saying that there's some kind of tape of instructions in the entire computer, everything that every piece of that computer and that robot can be traced all the way back to the central planner. And when you look at these biological systems, it's not that case at all. A lot of the behavior is exhibited by the cells throughout the xenobot. That behavior originated in the cells themselves, it didn't come from some central planning. In fact, if the individual cells are responding to sensory input from their environment, then it's the environment itself that is the central planner. The environment itself is driving the behavior of the entire robot, and each individual little part of that robot is just merely responding to the environment, but there isn't a centralized planner within the robot. Everything in this paper is thought-provoking, and you can just keep thinking about how does this apply to humans and human intelligence, and it kind of leads to a lot of interesting thoughts. Yeah, so back to our gray alien analogy here, right? If we say that the gray aliens are biological robots, these robots are not perfectly controllable by whoever designed them, right? These little gray alien xenobots are in a sense their own conscious entities. And they probably have their own thoughts, their own goals, their own plans, which is, right, you can actually project, okay, if in the year 2050 we have similar kinds of technology and we can create basically these entirely biological robots, those robots, will they be perfectly controllable? Probably not, right? You will be maybe able to kind of have some direction as to what they do, but they will have kind of their own consciousness and their own agency and their own behaviors that you wouldn't have been able to predict at the beginning. All right, finally we get to kind of the section here that is written by Levin. How much more do we have here? We have quite a lot more. Maybe we need to go a little quicker here. I think we're going to try to hit 1 hour. Developmental biology. Yeah, so again, he says that maybe we focus too much on looking at the way that life currently exists on Earth and thinking that life is limited to that. But in fact, the search space of life is much larger. And everything we have on Earth is really just an N of 1, right? At the end of the day, almost every single living thing in the world has DNA, it has these same basic components, and really it's just one path down the kind of potentially infinite search space of life. Again, kind of Levin here, asking questions, what we mean by robot, machines, like really I think maybe spending a little bit too much time thinking about terminology and how his research and this kind of new branch of research fits into the existing taxonomy of science. I feel like he'd kind of be better off just going ahead and running forward rather than kind of thinking about how it all fits together with what's currently there historically. Discovery. Yeah, so this is something interesting that Levin talks about in the again in that Lex podcast, where a lot of these little cells, these little frog cells that are used in the xenobots, they're not programmed to form these shapes. In fact, right, if we go back to the animal cap, right, when you take the animal cap and you separate it out from these other parts here, the mesoderm and the endoderm, the animal cap or the ectoderm will just form a ball, right? And it'll start exhibiting different behavior. So you got this subcomponent of a robot to behave differently by merely detaching it from the rest of the robot, right? So programming desired form and function by releasing natural constraints, right? Cells were liberated from the normal constraints of the rest of the embryo. Right, this is the craziest part. Their baseline behavior is to form a self-mobile proto-organism with individual and collective behaviors such as kinematic self-replication. Right. It's like if you cut off your finger and the finger grew a mouth and started eating. Right, it's kind of crazy to think about. See more about xenobots. Kind of the same notion as self-assembly. Okay, so here we have another figure. Again, figures are the most interesting part here. We have passive material, and we have a bunch of picture of plastic Lego bricks. Active material, we have frog cells. Computational material, this just looks like a bunch of resistors and transistors and being connected together inside the shape of some kind of animal and then following some kind of policy. And then agential material, and this is a single-celled organism covered in cilia with a flagella as well. So engineering is traditionally done with passive materials, right? So Lego bricks, which can only be dependent upon their shape and other physical properties, right? So here we have G. So you can, Lego bricks, you can use them to stack things, right? You can put them up and make a little tower out of Lego bricks, but the Lego bricks themselves are kind of dumb, and they're not going to do anything, and if that Lego brick tower falls over, you're not going to be able to do anything with that. And here in H, right, you're building the little Lego bricks out of cells, and maybe because they're cells, they can maintain this shape, they can regenerate, they can produce more of themselves, and so on. Increasingly engineered, computational media. Okay, so biorobotics enters a new phase transition where the material is agential. It is composed of subunits, living cells, right? Like you're no longer making stuff out of dead Lego bricks, you're making stuff out of little tiny robots that themselves have agency, right? Consciousness, some amount of self, they're running their own little sense, plan, act loops. And how do you make one bigger entity that has like a larger sense, plan, act loop out of a bunch of things that have small sense, plan, act loops? Does built-in competencies, agendas, problem solving, and all these different problem spaces. Talks about 3D printing as a way of kind of putting cells into a specific shape here. So kind of the same way that you can kind of use 3D printing or additive manufacturing to build a specific shape kind of layer by layer, you can probably do the same thing with cells. And I think there are people that do this. They can print little organoids, right, such as a little heart or a little brain. And people think that this is probably going to be a way to print replacement parts for humans, right? That's one kind of application that's kind of looming over the hill here. Progress is revealing a continuum of control strategies appropriate to active, computational, and agential material. Right. So he's saying that robotics has kind of been limited to passive materials, but as soon as you start considering active, computational, and agential materials all together, the kind of robotics field kind of becomes much more interesting. This is crazy too. So everything that has been done, these are wild type genomes, right? This is not a genetically modified frog cell. These are just generic frog cells. And right, what could you start doing if you could actually combine this, or if you had kind of this technology 10 years from now combined with CRISPR 10 years from now, right? I think that's going to get pretty crazy. Evolution discovered a trick. Control growth. A key aspect of the early generation of xenobots is precisely that they reveal the plasticity of the cell's ability to explore morphospace and behavioral space with the same genome. Yeah, so the same underlying code, right, which you can think of as the genome, can be used to program a huge variety of different behaviors, right? And this is kind of crazy because it's like if you had one code base, and that same code base could be used for a tiny little swarm robot, a Boston Dynamics dog, and then the Optimus robot, and then a giant construction crane. Like, that same software was used for a bunch of different form factors and behaviors and kind of lifestyles. And I think that's maybe where all of this is headed, right? Maybe that kind of sounds like the reality of deep learning and reinforcement learning, is that we're moving to this kind of unification of architectures. Everything is just this giant brick of transformers that is trained on huge amounts of data, and that maybe that's where this all goes. One thing that does everything rather than a huge amount of things that do one thing. I think this is another interesting part here. Kind of Levin introduces the concept of anatomical compiler, right? Where, hey, could you say as a human, I want this specific behavior, right? You describe what you want in language, right? Which is kind of the way that humans communicate what they want. And then you feed this through an anatomical compiler, and it will output kind of a set of instructions with specific cells and specific gene editing and specific orders of ways of like printing these cells and giving them a specific shape and layering different types of cells, such that that desire that the human formulated in language results in an actual specific anatomy that's suited to solve that problem. Yeah, and I think there's definitely something to this too, where I think progress in biology is going to go quicker if we are actively designing organoids and these kind of xenobots and really kind of playing with the different knobs of biology, rather than just sitting there and observing biology, kind of like you would in a big study about diet or something like that, like somewhere where you asked people what they ate and then kind of from that deduced, here's the best thing to eat. Brings out the big guns here, calling this an existential risk for humanity, better learning to understand and predict the behaviors of system composed of competent components, right? Collective intelligence. biosafety. Right, they biodegrade rapidly, so robots that are made out of living cells will eventually die, so you don't have to worry about them getting out of control because they'll just die. And I think that this is something that they actually use. I think that rats programmed to die pest control. There's some kind of no, but there is this whole, I don't exactly recall the details, but I think there's ways where they can introduce a bunch of rats into a wild population, and those rats have a kind of like a defect such that they will die. And then these introduced rats will breed with the kind of local population of rats, and then after a couple generations, all the rats will die because they have this kind of expiration date programmed into their genes. And I think that you could do something similar with these type of biorobots, right? You could make the gray aliens, but you could give them a lifetime of 10 years, so they automatically die. I think this is actually in science fiction. This is in the movie Blade Runner. There's a similar thing where these synthetic humans have a specific expiration date, so they can't cause too much trouble because they're programmed to die at a specific time. Okay, so we finally get to the conclusion here. Research is breaking the classical conception of robotics. Yep. I think this is kind of the biggest contribution of this entire paper, is that, hey, rather than designing robots out of these things like plastic and metal and kind of these hard components that are very, very predictable, but limited in their kind of robustness and their ability to sense the environment and kind of react accordingly, what if we started building robots out of biological components like cells? And I think this marriage of biology and robotics is going to produce some of the craziest stuff we've seen. And I think it's not just the way to achieve human immortality, but also kind of, it might even become a better way to create the kind of like ultimate home robot that everybody's talking about, the kind of Tesla's Optimus or Boston Dynamics Atlas. Like the best version of that might actually be biological, even though that's decades away from here. Again, talking about simulation and AI-driven design. Sim to real is very difficult. I don't know. I think it's even, I feel like it's going to be even harder for biological systems because there's so much we don't understand. But maybe there's something there. Yeah, it kind of makes a good point here. We still call it engineering, but it's no longer limited to the study of engines. And kind of the same thing will happen to computer science and robotics, where biology will kind of become embedded in this branch of science. Funded by DARPA. It's kind of crazy, right? Maybe they know. Maybe they know the aliens are xenobots. Alrighty, that does it for this live stream. Thank you for listening. I know this has probably been extremely painful, right? I am a complete noob to live streaming, so just messing around with a pen was awkward and getting all these things done, and I look forward to cringing at this video in the future. But if you're somehow listening to this, I appreciate you watching this video, and stay tuned. I'm going to keep publishing cool stuff. Thank you.